Welcome to By George, an 80 Players podcast here at the George Theater. I am your host and marketing associate, Miranda Zapst, and today I have with me...
I am Andy Pederson. I'm the Education and Theater for Young Audiences Director here at 80 Players at the George.
Andy, how did you end up here? How did you hear about 80 Players? Take us back a little bit through your history, maybe some education that led you to this point.
Twofold. My connection to 80 Players started with Jamie McGann, who is our, illustrious leader here. So Jamie and I were professors together in 2009. So we both started the same year in Concordia University, Chicago. He was a theater professor and I was an English professor. But both of us as playwrights, both of us have, graduate degrees in playwriting. And so we had a great affinity for each other, and we worked very well together. We wrote some plays together. But Jamie, he left after 5 years, went to North Carolina, and then to Texas, and then to Georgia, and then back to Texas. He's like in that southern space there. I'd been at Concordia for 15 years, and we'd actually come down in the summer of 2022. Okay. So it was Sound of Music was the show that was happening here. I had been the head writer for the LCMS, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod's National Youth Gathering, writing the video pieces and the drama pieces for their, it was a triannual, huge event, and it was happening in Houston at Minute Maid Park. Rest in peace, Minute Maid Park. I don't even know what the new one is called, but we were down here. And, Jamie said, hey, come see a show. And so we came and saw the show. It was fantastic. And, just saw this gorgeous theater, and we stayed with them for a couple of days. But then my family and I, we spent 3 weeks in Texas. We went everywhere because we were never coming back. That was a very we went to Houston, we went to Galveston, we went to San Antonio, we went to Austin, we went to Waco, and then Dallas, Fort Worth area, and all the things you do in Texas, because we were never, ever coming back. We were going to do this, and then that was it. But then I got commissioned in 2022 to write this play. And so I'd been working on that for some time and was hoping for the, 2024 was going to be one that was the reading was going to be, which it was. But in the span between while I was writing that, this education department was relaunched, and it was the right time for my family, and it was just God opened a lot of doors, and we found ourselves down here in Houston on a permanent level. So that was quite the surprise. So I guess I've stopped saying I'm never going to do things because God will send you there. That's exactly right. Yeah.
So going back, I forgot to mention Andy, while being our education director, also wrote our upcoming show, How to Die: The Life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Yes.
And so that's what we're going to be talking about. But before we get into all of that, I do want to give some context. So you're a playwright.
Yes.
So was this something that you always knew that you wanted to do?
No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Could you tell me about that?
Sure. So when I was in high school, I wanted to be a stand-up comedian.
Okay.
But again, it was one of those dreams that, sometimes as a practical Midwesterner, I was like, it seems like a lot of time on the road. Like I loved comedy and I loved that piece. And I went to a big public high school. I went to Lutheran grade school and Lutheran college, but like a big public high school. And you were kind of either in sports or you were in the arts. There was not a lot of crossover. So I played football and I wrestled and I threw shot and disc, and I was not, involved in theater at all. So that was not kind of part of my radar until I went to Concordia, Chicago, which is, a small Lutheran college, and I played football, but I also found my way from the English department, which I was originally there, into the theater department. So I did both. I was, on stage and then also on the field. But in terms of playwriting, it was something that I'd kind of had in the back of my head that like I'd written a lot of like sketches and scenes and stuff for classes, just as part of, various assignments. But it wasn't until when I was working, I have a master's in English and I have an MFA in playwriting, that I was in a master's class, doing my MA, and I took playwriting as, one of my courses, and it just really opened everything up. So that was summer of, I would say 2004. And then from that point in time, it was just been, I wrote a series of one-act plays. It was a play called Blind Ferrets. That was my first kind of, great complete comic. It was about a pet shop, Pete's Partials Pets. He sold damaged animals to people who, and so, damaged animals, it was damaged people. It was very funny. It was very, so that, my good friend of mine, Brian Fruits, who's directed here at 80 Players, directed that in Chicago in 2005. Yeah.
Wow. So always a creative at heart. Like you wanted.
Yes. And so I'd been directing,
Right.
you know, I taught high school for 8 years before I taught, you know, at college level. And so, you know, I'd always been doing things that have been, and the performative nature is, I think, just kind of built into teaching and education. I think that there is an art side to it, as well as all the preparation and the learning and the, you know, planning.
So I'm sorry, this is my last thing about your past, but you said that you've been on stage, so you have performed?
Yeah. So I was, there was a moment in time, in a very brief moment, where I did actually consider trying to pursue acting. So I acted in undergrad, and then when I was in graduate school, when I was doing my I went to a very unique master's program. So Middlebury College in Vermont, you know, very fancy pantsy, you know, New England, you know, place. And Vermont is one of my favorite, like, you know, that's the place I think of most often. But the program was a summer program geared toward English teachers. So it was the best of American and British professors. So it was all Big Ten and Ivy League and Oxford professors who were teaching in this program. So my master's degree was, you know, taught by Yale professors and professors from University of Iowa and Wisconsin and Harvard and like Tufts and, like, you know, so it was great. I got this amazing education. But what was fascinating is that it was 5 summers, and if you were on the Vermont campus, the Trinity Rep, so Trinity Rep Theater, which is connected with Brown University, they brought a company in residence, and you had these professional shows that were happening as part of the summer, and some of the roles were available for students and faculty. So I played Elbow in Measure for Measure by Shakespeare, and so I acted alongside. And actually, so this is actually a weird tie. Chris Hutchinson and his wife, Elizabeth Bunch Hutchinson, who are company members at the Alley, were part of that company. In fact, that they met in Vermont. And so I got to know Chris and Elizabeth, who are phenomenal people and unbelievable actors. But I acted, you know, got to act with world-class actors. And Pulitzer Prize winning poets. And so there was a moment in time where I was in very much with that group of Brown professors. And I was like, you know, is this something? And there was a moment where I was like, is this something I maybe should pursue? And again, I decided I needed much better looking people to say my lines for me. And so that's why I became a playwright. Like, that was the goal. So that was, that was where I went. Yeah.
That's incredible. And that's going to be amazing for the end of the episode when I ask about any like on stage or any job like mishaps that you've had. Great. Awesome. Let's get into Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Okay. So you were commissioned to write this play in 2022.
Yes.
Well, I guess, where did it even come from? Was it something that you were told to write? Is it something that you were like, this is what I'm going to write?
Well, so in two ways, right? So I'm a Lutheran, been a Lutheran my entire life. And Dietrich, you know, as a Lutheran pastor, and he's, you know, he's somebody that I studied in undergrad as part of theology classes. What I'm most attracted to about him as a theologian is that he had this vision of theology that he wanted to make it, you know, and and maybe I'm oversimplifying, but make it connect in a concrete way with people. You know, that, you know, like theology is, it can be kind of mysterious and mystical, and you're talking about the divine, you're talking about things that are beyond kind of human comprehension in some ways. We're trying to make that relatable or connectable in a human space. And what Dietrich saw was that human space actually came, you know, in the form of community, and that it wasn't just, you know, inside the fellowship of people who were, you know, believers. I mean, there is a lot of his writing that it's like, no, we find this community and this is where we need to exist, because that's how the church is, and that the church needs to exist in a community for, you know, each other, but also for those even outside the church. You know, and you know, his work to try to, I don't know, I'm getting far off field from the question.
No, please.
So all that said, Bonhoeffer had been part of my, you know, my training as an undergrad, and somebody that I found really compelling. And so Jamie McGann had said, you know, we'd like a new play. So there's actually been a substantial number of plays written about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, of course, because his story is pretty compelling. And so, I mean, I think most famously, there's a play called The Beams Are Creaking, which That's I believe, and there's actually a picture of Kevin as Bonhoeffer when you come in. Right there when you come in the box office doors. I see it every morning on my way in. But I think one of the pieces is that a lot of the plays, and a lot of the I think the stage-based works, all have different goals, different angles, right? Different elements. Some that are really focused on just his letters, some that focused on his relationship with Maria, the woman he was engaged to, and kind of their burgeoning relationship while he was locked away in prison, and just that connection. Some have focused very heavily on the plot. I think that's the sensational part, right? That he's involved in plots to kill Hitler,
right?
Which is, an important part of his story, but as a theologian, as an individual, I think that actually covers over some of the more radical and I think just amazing parts of his theology. So Jamie had said we want a new play about Bonhoeffer, and he, you are the guy who knows, who I'd like to, connect on that. And so I was thrilled, but then also too, the challenge was, how do you tell this story without, I think it's very easy to cheapen or to narrow just to a space of going, it's just this, conspiracy piece, or it's just, or to oversell like the romance piece, or to, the things that, a Hollywood avenue to, bring that in.
Of course. It's so fascinating to hear you talk about it, because it puts everything into kind of a perspective. And I know when audiences come in and see this show, they'll understand what I'm saying. And I worry that I'll give spoilers away, but I also feel like you can't give spoilers away.
The play's called How to Die. I mean, we know where that's going.
Right. Yeah. But it's so interesting to hear it from like a kind of eagle eyes view, because I think you do such a great job of bringing all of those stories together. It doesn't feel like one, like the romance is in there and the plots are in there and the theology is in there, but it doesn't feel like it's all like it's one of those sensationalized.
Yeah.
And it is genuinely like a good depiction of his life, I feel like.
No, thanks.
I know, because it's told from his best friend's perspective.
Yeah.
How did that idea come about?
So Eberhard Bethge is, I think I wrote that in my playwright's note, that I always say a little prayer of thanks for his faithfulness and dedication. So he met Dietrich at Finkenwalde, which was that kind of rebel seminary that, Dietrich had set up. He said, so the confessing church was trying to stay clear of all that was happening as the Third Reich was taking over the church and making these, kind of insidious demands on the pastors and on the parishioners and on all these pieces. And so Dietrich had this rebel seminary, and Eberhard was a favorite student, but also then became, his closest confidant and best friend. And Eberhard wrote a massive biography. So he's part of the reason. I mean, Dietrich had published books before, his martyrdom, but there was all these letters and all of these additional pieces that Eberhard had that allowed us to get a better glimpse too of this man and understand this. So when Eberhard published his, it's over 1,000 pages. I mean, It's a massive biography, and it's wonderful because he takes such care to not make him like a saint. He wasn't, wasn't just hero worship. But I mean, clearly, that Bethge loved and admired, Dietrich, but he was really dedicated to putting out work that was going to, tell the story the best it could. And so then subsequent books, as more materials have been found or more letters have become exposed. So there's been some great biographies that have come, after that point. But the starting point, so in my head, whatever story gets told about Dietrich, actually for the greater, wider world, comes from Bethge. Bethge as a character is not just, in the story, which he is, but he's also outside of it, in my mind, kind of, pushing this story out to the wider world. So that was, part of why I have, Bethge as both in and outside the play.
And the research portion of it is, like you said, you grew up and this was part of your education and upbringing. How much additional research was required to?
So a lot. So I spent my process on this was, I had read a lot of Bonhoeffer's works. I mean, in particular, the two that were immediately came to mind was a book called Life Together, which was, very much about this space of Christian community. I read that in a theology class. And then a book that we read in a class called History of Christian Biography called The Cost of Discipleship, which is probably his most famous, right? So where this idea of cheap grace and costly grace, and he talks about really just trying to understand, what it means to truly follow Jesus. And in fact, inadvertently, I think the title of my play comes from a line that he wrote in that book. It wasn't until I was providing quotes for marketing that I was like, oh, That's where it came from. But he said, when Christ, bids a man to follow, he bids him come and die, right? Like, and that's, essentially where this stems from. So I would say about 16 months in a pretty intensive research, and I was reading not only Dietrich's works, but works around scholarly works about his life and different perspectives. A couple of books, I'm going to, Ferdinand Schliepenziepen, it's a super long German last name, who wrote a really great, he was a friend and student of Eberhard Bebke. And so he wrote this, like kind of this next official with more material in it. It's not as long, but it's definitely more complete in the sense that he had access to more than Bebke did.
Right.
And then there's a great book by Reggie Williams called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, which was about Bonhoeffer's year in Harlem. And that actually was, for me, in all the biographies, they talk about Dietrich meeting Jesus in Harlem. And this sense for me was very much that, he grew up in a family that had access to a lot of culture, a lot of, I don't want to say power, but they were a well-to-do family. His father was, a famous psychiatrist. His mother was a daughter of a professor. They had, just culture and life and a lot. It was pretty easy for them financially, socially, culturally. And so becoming a theologian, at least initially, was not always, at least early on, I think, is about his love of Christ, but definitely like this is an area he could excel and differentiate himself in. And I think that calling prepared him, because I'm not saying that he wasn't a Christian until this point. I mean, far from it. I think he was really absolutely a believer and loved the Lord. But when he was in Harlem, he got a chance to see how Jesus mattered, not, just as a concept, but in the day-to-day life of people in reality. So I spent 16 months reading and taking notes, and I do a lot of stuff analog, a lot of pencil, a lot of notebook, and just, shaping all this. And then I spent 4 days in the summer of 2023. Family friends lent me a cabin that had really terrible internet connection, and which is exactly what I needed. I needed to, kind of just get away from work and family and everything, and just spend 4 days. And so I wrote the first draft, the first 95 pages in those 4 days. I just sat down and just, plowed through and got this chunk out, because you can't edit what's not there. And then from there, I started to shape and reshape the story until I had a complete draft that fall to send to Jamie, and for him to go, all right, I think we're on the right track.
Yeah. I think this is it. I think this is something. Okay. So many questions. How, with the amount of research that you've done and writing it, how do you find that balance of reality and dramatization? Well,
so, and this might be different for every writer, is that research can end up sometimes being a crutch to avoid the work, because researching feels like you're doing work, and you are, but at a certain point, the research is just there as, so I felt like, it's been, almost a year and a half really diving deep into things. And my approach first is going to be as a playwright, so I know that like this needs to be a play, this needs to be dramatic, this needs to be, and there's going to be some parts that, of the play, like I have been truthful and faithful to, his story. There are some conflations because they're dramatically better.
Right,
I mean, this is not a lecture, this is a play, and so this is an account of his life, and but again, I would hope that people would see that as a faithful account of his. So yes, my goal, if I'm trying to put on a hat first, is that it's playwright first,
right,
over everything else. So that's, there's a disgraced Christian comedian named Mike Warnke, who and I'll bring this up, is that he said, he was a comedian and he was a Christian, and he said, my job as a comedian is to get the laugh. And so, if you're not laughing, sometimes I got to go right to the toilet. I'll get the laugh first and the forgiveness later. But I mean, so, which I thought, but again, I've always thought about that as a playwright, not that I'm going to do anything to make the audience respond, but I'm thinking the play comes first.
Right.
And so that's going to be the piece. And then and if I focus on that portion, then I'm going to tell the truth about the characters and the people in the story. And that's, hopefully what I did. Yeah.
How does it come to, I guess, dialogue then? Because my brain is kind of going through the scenario of doing all this research, reading all these letters, reading everything. I feel like you really get a sense of like who he is. Yeah. And then how do you get like his tone through?
So, yeah, that's a tough question. I don't know if I can have like maybe even a concrete answer that's going to be like, right. I mean, I think that part of it is maybe the osmosis of like, I've spent so much time reading and thinking about, and then just starting to, shape this. Okay, so what were the things that he was saying? What were the phrases? How was it? Because there's a few times where I've quoted him directly.
Okay.
There's a few times where I've, there's some very, well, in translation, it's not in German. So I quoted his,
That's also, wow. Yeah, another
and so also thinking about too, how his presence, just I tried to get his diction, his cadence, his I don't have any recordings of him speaking, but like his in his sermons and in his letters, the choices that a writer makes start to kind of weave into like, and that becomes part of like those thought patterns. So I tried to not mimic those exactly, because if you're trying to just mimic it, sometimes that'll become off like too cardboard, that he's, a one-dimensional kind of character.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't have a really good clear-cut answer.
That's okay. Yeah. I just, because I had talked to an actor, I think it was literally the last episode I did with Kevin Crouch, him talking about his experience being on stage and the difference between like a story that it was completely fictional and then playing an actual like historical figure, because so many of the plays and the writings have direct quotes, and so you have to say them verbatim because people know. Yeah. And so I guess that was where my mind was coming from, but then also to throw in the layer of like, it was also all in German. And, like,
and none of my research was in German. I should point out.
I know. But the person and his life, yeah.
Well, and I mean, if I can just interject this here too.
No, please.
I think one of the things too about Bonhoeffer is that we have to remember. I think it's very easy for us as Americans in general to believe that we understand every context, and I think his context is so. We can understand it intellectually. Like he was in World War II. We know a lot about World War II. We've seen the books. We've seen the Tom Hanks movie. We've seen, we've Saved Private Ryan. We know, right? We've seen all of it. But what we can't know, I don't think, is how. Well, I think we come from a place of certainty because we know how it ended, or we know how it wound down. And the people living in it day to day in those moments, it's a radically different space, and so you have to reorient everything in your life to the possibility that the world may collapse, that they might not recover. And there were very real days where that possibility was just sitting right in front of Dietrich, because he saw these things that were happening, and he saw things because of his connections in the Abwehr with, his brother Klaus and his brother-in-law Hans. He had access to things that other people didn't. And so these atrocities are even, beyond, what most people knew about until years later. And so I think our impulse to be like, I get exactly where he's coming from, to put ourselves in that context, it's tough. I very often felt myself having to pull back again and again from being like, this is how it would be. I'm like, nope, that's too much of the now. Like I need to go, what's the uncertainty? What's the not knowing about the next day, but having faith that God's put you in a position to do this very thing.
Yeah. And I talk about it already, like in the now of how did people get here, and that God's path and his plan is always perfect. And to have a play that kind of encapsulates that is incredible. So in the research that you did, was there anything about Dietrich that you found out through the letters, or anything that you had not known before or didn't assume that this is, like, I don't know, part of his personality? Or
well, I mean, I think what we envision, right, is somebody who's going to be involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler is a very serious individual, and I think that's probably true. Yeah. But I mean, I think there's a warmness. At least I hope there's a warmness, humanness to him that kind of comes through. Like he's actually pretty funny. I mean, there's some stories from his youth where he's as a boy, right? He had 7 siblings, and he's pulling pranks and doing things that you would absolutely assume kids do. Like actually kids don't change. It's just the context of the day-to-day life, right? And so it's those pieces. I think also too, for as strong and as intelligent as he was, I think the dependence that he had on his parents, even when he was in prison, and the letters that he would send them. I think that this space of just how how much that circle of his family mattered to him. You know, and I knew that, and it's not necessarily a revelation, but definitely one that I found just really compelling. You know, just, you know, it humanized him, is that he was, of course, thinking of his family all the time, and that's a wonderful space. His sister, Sabina, his twin sister, there's Charles Marsh's biography, A Strange Glory. That was actually one of the anchor points of getting started. When he was 8 years old, him and his twin sister, Sabina, would stay up well past their bedtime talking about eternity, and that's only as precocious German children can do, right?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Like you can tell, like this is the kind of household that he grew up in. Is that like they're not like sneaking to the refrigerator, like, no, they're staying up all night talking about like what does eternity mean. Now we don't know the content of those conversations, so my mind is of course an imagined conversation, but you know they're still 8 years old, and so their world and their context is still very finite and concrete in the family sphere and what this is, but they know that there's something bigger than themselves. And so how does that factor in when you think about eternity? Like, you know, when was the first time you as a kid were aware of eternity? And then what does that do? Like what does that do to you? Like when you're like, and you're like, because, you know, they had modeled in their home very serious conversation. If you're going to have a conversation, oh no, it was going to be serious, and you were going to have to defend whatever position you had. And that's when he announces he's going to be a theologian at the dinner table. No. Like, it's not just like, well, hey, good for you. It's like, no, you better defend whatever you're coming with. And so I think that's a fascinating piece of his, you know, existence.
Right. So, okay, the threads, because I don't think this is something that, I know it's something that's not going to make it into the actual stage production of it, but I want to point it out because I think it's such a good, I wanted it so badly. So in the play, in the stage directions, you have the characters taking these pieces of thread and or rope and bringing them across stage. Where did that idea come from?
So one of the things I was thinking about, right, was because I was telling a story that, you know, and this is, I guess, kind of part of the challenge of the style of this play, which covers, you know, his whole life, right, from kind of childhood through, you know, his last day, you know. And so how do you do justice, and how do you show that you can't show everything? And, you know, I'll also throw this out here. David Ball, he's a playwright, theater educator. He wrote a great book called Backwards and Forwards. And it actually looks like a manual for fixing telephones. It's the worst cover, but it's a great book. Terrible subtitle too, A Manual for Reading Plays. But it's one of the more supremely useful books about thinking about how action works, about what causes something else to happen. You know, talking about dominoes, and like, you know, he uses triggers and heaps. You know, there's an action and then a completion of an action. And so in my mind, I was thinking about, you know, visually, theatrically, I know how these dominoes essentially across years and decades, one knocks into the other, right? Because sometimes a domino that starts falling doesn't actually land, you know, like right away. It's going to hit something, but then that something, you know, clicks in. So when Dietrich is in Harlem, when he comes to America, he's in New York. He has a terrible time. He hates American theology. He thinks it's so watered down. He thinks it's terrible, but it's then a young African-American pastor named Frank Fisher from Atlanta who brings him to Harlem, an Abyssinian Baptist church. And like, that's when the domino lands. You're like, oh, and he sees then how the plight of, you know, African-Americans in the 30s in America, how they are, you know, segregated and, you know, just racist attitudes and behaviors, and just this ostracizing, and he can't believe it. Right. And this domino then knocks into this next space. Cause when he comes home to Germany, then he's able to see, you know, he sees with fresh eyes that kind of, you know, bigotry happening with, you know, the Jewish population in Berlin, and needing to step up and say something, you know, in that way. So, you know, I know the thread was the question.
No,
so like, yeah, so visually, sometimes I think about, well, what would be impossible to stage?
Okay.
And like, what would be a problem for the director, but not for me?
Right.
You know? And so that that's not maybe a great game to play, but I visually, the more I thought about it, I thought, if this, you know, visually, because I mean, I think that there is something to that you, everything that we have contact with, it becomes part of, you know, who we are, even if we're not realizing the shape that it'll eventually take in our lives down the road. And so this thread becomes maybe a very visual, you know, reminder or connector. Maybe some down the road, maybe a future production will go to the threads. I don't know. I mean, I will say this, Kevin Dean, who is our director, last year during the reading, we spent a lot of time talking about what that would actually look like. And I know he spent a lot of time trying to think about, well, okay, how do you make that work? How do you make that work on stage with actors and changes and things? And that's a good question. And that's, I will say without spoiling, that what's going to happen visually is stunning and gorgeous. And our set designer and our projections, so Kirk Domer and then Michael Mullins, just absolute home runs.
Yeah.
So like visually, it's still going to be extremely powerful. But yeah, the thread piece, I know, that was fun. That also helped as I was writing.
Yeah.
And getting through. And I think visually the ending with the thread, that would have been a cool moment. But we'll maybe save that for
for a future production or something like that. It was just I just love it when stories do that, and I love to read. And so whenever you have a visual element like that, it's so powerful. And so I was like, oh, how are we going to do it?
Because I had several people ask me last year after the Metzler reading, hey, how does that happen? I'm like, oh, you got to talk to Kevin. Yeah, I'm like, that's not
my problem. No.
So that's
let's go into a little bit of the rehearsal of it. So you've written the play, obviously. Kevin's directing it. How much of a hand do you have in the rehearsals and the putting legs up on this show?
So Kevin and I work very well together. I mean, obviously, Kevin is a very generous director and also very, I think, intuitive. He himself is an actor. I think he has that innate sense of theatricality, which is really great, and he really brings that out. And so I did the table work with the cast, and we sat down, read through it, talked through it, made some line changes and pieces there. And I've not been at every rehearsal because also too, in the same way, I really trust Kevin and what we're on the same page. And so, Kevin and I, yesterday we had a great meeting with Michael about, the final scene. And then now that we have this set that's being built here, and we actually have these physical dimensions, here's where and this and this and this. And, it's really exciting. So we're in constant kind of collaboration on those pieces. And then actors are like, hey, this line, as I'm saying it, like the rhythm is a little off or this is a little off. Okay, let's move some things around. So for the most part, it's kind of just correcting my errors, on, in phrasing. But yeah, so the process has been great. And the cast is wonderful. I mean, they're just a really talented group, and they really have, I think just, they're excited about the story, and they're excited about this production, and also just, how it's being told. And I think that comes through. So it's been really fun to watch them in rehearsal and watch, Kevin direct and I'm excited to, when they, get here next week on the stage here, to see this kind of start to shape up.
Right. Well, my next thing I was going to ask, like, what's your favorite part about the staged aspect of it now? Like, what's your favorite prop? I don't know, something on stage. I'm like, oh, we don't have it on a stage yet.
Well, no, but I mean, so it's, that'll be a good question. I mean, that might change once we get everything in the space. I mean, I
guess what's something you're really looking forward to seeing?
So I'm really looking forward to seeing Dietrich in New York. That sequence. There's kind of like I would call them like almost mini scenes, that are of his time in New York. That segment, as he's transitioning from kind of angry German, who's really upset about all the theology here, to somebody who's, had his world changed. Because there was also a French pastor named Jean Lasserre who he met, and Jean was a deeply committed pacifist. And, one of the things that Dietrich couldn't maybe square was how you couldn't fight for your country, and Lasserre was saying, no, like, you only need to fight for radical peace. Like, that's not the thing you should be doing. It was a very strong stance that Dietrich, I don't think, bought at the time, and I obviously still maybe didn't buy fully, but it changed unequivocally who he was.
Right.
So that segment, but again too, like, I mean, each segment, I with these actors are so great, and watching the interplay too between, we have kind of one Nazi who's really kind of standing in for all of the that's also like a conflation, a dramatic space, right? Like, there's the chief interrogator Manfred Broder really only appears at the end of the story in Dietrich's life, but in the play he's kind of throughout, right? Because you can't hire a million actors.
No, he's all the bad guys.
He's all the bad guys. And John is incredible. John played it in the reading, John Felch, and he's He's so good. So, I mean, it's just, the cast is wonderful. I mean, they really, really are. And I love watching those discoveries happen, as the scenes are unfolding, the dynamics in the family, the dynamics in the friendships and just all of the different spaces that are there. So, yeah.
Awesome. And we're just going to go into our final little lightning round questions here. Whether you've been on stage, backstage, in the writing process, what has been a mishap that has happened to you that maybe keeps you up at night?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, whatever keeps me up at night, I think is just a product of being in my mid 40s. I don't know if there's any anything dramatic that's, that, I'll say this. There's a story I tell pretty frequently. It was not as much a mishap, but, I wrote a romantic comedy called Yellow Light.
Okay.
It's been in Chicago, it was in Memphis. And in 2010, I think this was the first play that my in-laws had seen. My wife and I got married in 2007. So, this is my first show that I think that they had seen. They came down to Chicago and saw it. And the first thing my mother-in-law said to me, so on the street outside Gorilla Tango Theater on Milwaukee in Chicago, she said, "What is wrong with you?" And that's been my favorite review of any play. Yeah. I mean, she was laughing. She's like, "What is wrong with you?" And I'm like, yeah, because the play is I mean, it's funny and it's sweet, but there's also the end of the play, this is a nice clean podcast, but like there's it did nothing dirty, but like there is, it's probably a little gross, and she just she's like, where is your brain that you
right.
so what is wrong with you? That was the first thing she said to me. Not like I was really funny, but her first response was, what is wrong with you? I will also tell you this: Jamie McGann and I we wrote a play about the sinking of the USS Indianapolis. So that was another historical play.
Okay.
And Charles. So if you've seen Jaws,
yeah. So
Captain Quint was a crewman on the Indianapolis and talked about the shark attack. So this is a horrifying true story. So this play was about Captain Charles McVeigh and, his trauma and his suicide and all of these things. And it was a play that we had done with our students at Concordia in 2012, had gone to the Kennedy Center College Theater Festival, had been in New York, had been in North Carolina, and it was in Chicago in 2017. And the director had invited, director Brian Fruits had invited the survivors organization to come see it.
Okay.
And they came out and, expecting to tear this thing apart, and they fell in love with it. And then so one weekend we had Kim Roller, who was the, kind of the executive there. And then next weekend there were actual survivors who were in the audience. And then Captain Bill Tody from the Pentagon.
Wow.
Who came to see it. We're this little tiny theater in Chicago. And after the production, Captain Tody said to me, he said, "Hey, I just, he was really impressed with how Jamie and I were able to get into the mind of McVeigh just as a Navy man." And he said, "Now I'm going to correct you." Please, give me. He said, "Now, early on in the show, when one of the sailors is calling for a medic, that's incorrect. They would be calling for a corpsman. Everybody in the Navy knows they'd be calling for a corpsman." I said, "Oh, absolutely. I'm going to make that change." Now, I was never going to make that change because most of our audience members aren't going to know that. But absolutely in the moment. Flash forward one year, the show was in Indianapolis in 2018 at the actual survivors reunion. They brought us out, and so the families, and it was a humbling and remarkable event. But Captain Tody was there again, and he pulled me aside. He saw the show again. He said, "I thought I told you to change it." "Captain, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think you'd ever see the show again." And he was, but I mean, that's, he was very gracious, and he's a wonderful, wonderful man. But but that too, like, whenever you write about historical things, you run the risk of people like, that's not how it was. You're like, yeah, you're right. I mean, but it is how it is in this play.
But didn't you enjoy sitting here watching the story?
But I mean, but the danger is, though, if it takes somebody out too far.
Right.
You're like, ooh, so. But yeah.
Do you prefer to write historical or purely fiction?
No, I mean, I think, I've written both.
Okay.
And I think, finding the kind of well-rounded story in a historical figure is interesting or compelling.
Yeah.
With the play that Jamie and I wrote, In the Soundless Awe, we really focused on his nightmares, right?
Mm.
Something we couldn't possibly know.
Right.
Like, we knew he suffered from these traumas, but like, we were able to be more theatrical with that. There's things that I know about Dietrich's life that are factual and, provable, but there are things that the sense of truth about like how he would have responded to certain things or certain moments, you conflate it for that dramatic, So I guess to answer the question is I don't know if I prefer one over the other. I would say it's probably a little bit more, you maybe get in less trouble with you can just right off the top of your head.
Right.
Not
you don't have as many people coming in and going, actually.
You just said your mother-in-law showing up saying what is wrong with you. So,
who raised you?
Yeah. Like what is, what is wrong with you? I can still, very clear as day. Yeah.
That's amazing.
15 years later. Yeah.
Okay. I have this one written down because it was a specific. How has writing this play changed either your perspective on faith, resistance, or sacrifice?
Well, I think one of the things that's easy to miss is that, Dietrich gets executed, right? Mm-hmm. There's a couple of Bible stories that are woven into the play, the story of Daniel and then the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Mm-hmm. People who were tested in the Old Testament, who had to stand in the lion's den or in the fiery furnace. And, those are great analogs to what Dietrich had to do in some measure. And that a life of service, really is never yours. And I think that's it's a hard thing to follow. I think truly is. And I that's a wonderful thing that I think to aspire to is that, when you dedicate to serve, God, to serve, the truth there, and that's going to put you at odds with a lot of things in this world. It doesn't always work out in a prosperity gospel sort of way. That's just like, hey, if you pray hard enough, if you believe hard enough, good things are going to come your way. Well, yeah, but not the good things of, physical safety or money or, notoriety or any of those pieces. But what's going to come is that you've lived the life that is, worthy of the gospel that you're trying to emulate, and I think in so many ways that's what Dietrich did. So, he even more impossible not in a way that, we shouldn't even try, but like impossible in like a awe-inspiring sort of way. Right. Just that, and I'm sure there were really human moments of his, fear or trepidation or even just like frustration at like, why God, like why this moment, why me, why all of these things. But still, I think to stay that course is remarkable. Even to find, his time in Tegel prison, and I'm probably going too far off a field here on this, but as a prisoner, he's doing things that makes the lives better of everyone he comes in contact with, other prisoners, the guards. He's mapping out a new air raid evacuation plan. He's not an employee, right? But what he's doing is he's like, he's making the lives better because like when you are there to serve, like that's what you do. And like that's a pretty great standard to try to, aim for.
Right.
Yeah.
Why do you think people should come see the play?
Well, I think, here's my hope, right?
Why should people come see the play?
Well, first off, unbelievable cast, wonderful direction, the set, the projection. Aside from the fact that as a play, I think it's going to be outstanding, just from all of those amazing elements in this beautiful, beautiful theater here on Westheimer in Houston. But I think also too that what I'm gonna say this too, and I don't want to offend anybody, but I think what a lot of people maybe oversimplify about Dietrich, I don't want to say get wrong, but I think oversimplify is that it's just one way this or one way that way, that he's either all resistance or he's all social justice or he's all, just one thing. And that's not the truth. Is that what spurred him towards the way that he responded to the world was his faith. And that comes to reckoning with things that aren't going to squarely fit in one column or another, right? The space of having to kill, the space of having to lie, all of these things we say, oh yeah, absolutely. You do those things to try to oust Hitler and to, bring down the Nazi regime. But for a truly, considerate and moral character who's trying to figure out, is this the path that God wants me to take? Like, we justify some pretty terrible things as human beings, for in God's will. So I think that trying to find the space of like, what is truly the will of God. Like, I think the challenge of like listening. Because one of the things that Dietrich does again and again is he continually puts himself back in the path of where is Christ in this? You know, he tried to find Christ not just in the big unanswerable questions. There's a great part in his letters where he talks about, in his ethics, where he's talking about that we need to not just look for Christ, you know, in the big unanswerable things, that God's in the mysteries, which God is. Mm-hmm. But like God's in the concrete stuff that we know, like that we figured out, like there it is. And so it all has to stem from, you know, where God is at the center. And so, you know, it's my hope that people come and see this and then have to grapple with, are we too easily putting things in columns because that's just more comfortable? It's way easier to dislike or to disregard somebody's opinion or belief because it's not mine. And I know I'm correct without ever having to wrestle with the moral questions of whether or not, you know, there are some spaces in between, some daylight between, you know, what I think is true and right and what actually, you know, might be true and right.
Right.
So that's my hope, is that people, you know, will walk away and think about questions rather than find easy answers.
Right. Have more questions. Well, thank you so much for being on this episode of the podcast. And thank you guys so much for listening. When you come see How to Die, as you should, How to Die, The Life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, it's playing April 9th through May 4th. And be open to the questions that this play is going to pose. But yeah, thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye. This has been By George, an 80 Players at the George Theater podcast, hosted and produced by Miranda Zapes. Listen anywhere you listen to podcasts and follow us on Instagram at By George Theater. That's THEATRE. Sure to like, share, and subscribe. And By George, we'll see y'all next time.
Kevin Crouch played the Bonhoeffer character last year.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, he was Bonhoeffer. Yeah.
Oh, that's
in the reading.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And we didn't decide. No.
No. So because he had been in Texas Carol, and then did the Foreigner.
He was going to do 3 in a row.
And the aforementioned Huntsville is pretty far away.
Right.
But David Kenner, who's playing Dietrich, is fantastic, and yeah, he's so good. Yeah.
I've gone to one rehearsal. By the time I record these podcasts, I've only ever been to one rehearsal of a show.
Yeah.
But I think he's the voice, the English voice that we have in the advertisements as well.
Yes.
And now that's just who Dietrich
that's who he is,
sounds to me. Every time I hear his voice, I'm like, oh, that's Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Right. That's exactly who he is. Yeah.